collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, we'll hear about a conference on youth unemployment.
Before the crisis, Cyprus had relatively low unemployment and again relatively low youth unemployment. But what is amazing is that in 5-6 years during the crisis, this number has surpassed enormously the EU average.
A piano recital with Yiannis Georgiou.
I feel it's just basically 3 cycles that I'm playing in this program, the Schumann, the Ikonomou and the Mussorgsky.
And teaching businesses responsible reporting of CSR and sustainability.
Global Reporting Initiative is the most important organization in the world when it comes to sustainability reporting.
Next Friday, there's a one-day conference entitled Youth Unemployment in Cyprus, an examination of the lost generation. Well, I think we've discussed unemployment and particularly youth unemployment many times on the programme before. But at this conference, a report is going to be issued, and one of the authors is Grigoris Ioannou from the University of Cyprus. Grigoris, we know that there's a huge problem with unemployment in general, but the people hit the hardest, I think, across Europe, Cyprus isn't unusual in this, are young people. So what was the idea behind doing the report, and how did you go about doing it? Who did you talk to?
The report was commissioned by Friedrich Depper Stiftung. This is a research center, an international research center based in Germany but having branches in many European countries. It did a multi-country report studying youth unemployment in many European countries a couple of years ago. And this time it commissioned myself and Sertaç Sonan to do a similar study based on the same template, based on the same questions and discussing the same issues with respect to Cyprus, both in the territory under the control of the Republic, but also in the north. The report is published now, and this is going to be presented next Friday at the University of Nicosia, where we will, besides presenting it, we will also discuss it along with the stakeholders, such as trade unionists, employers, NGOs and officials from the state.
We're talking here about how many young people?
We're talking about tens of thousands of young people from both communities. The numbers, it depends on the definitions employed. Usually the European Union defines youth as those aged between 16 and 25. This is the definition that Eurostat figures that we have used. Of course, we qualify for the case of Cyprus because of this trend that there is in Cyprus, both north and south, to have military service and a large proportion of young people going to university, some of them continuing into postgraduate studies and so on, therefore delaying their attempted entry into the labour market. We try to take that into consideration in our analysis. But you're right, it is a European problem. It is a huge problem that became much worse during the crisis. The crisis hit this section of the population much harder. It was in a vulnerable position anyway before the crisis, and as the crisis hit on in a number of countries, especially Southern Europe, this became much worse. Before the crisis, Cyprus had relatively low unemployment and again relatively low youth unemployment. But what is amazing is that in 5-6 years during the crisis, this number has surpassed enormously the EU average, the Eurozone average, and the number is now much greater than the northern part of Cyprus, which before the crisis used to be a relatively high number, a high percentage of youth unemployment. In the last years in the north, the situation seems somehow improving in terms of this aspect.
How has the North turned it around? Is there something we can learn from what they've done? If theirs is going down but ours is going up? And I also want to ask you about overqualification, because you mentioned the fact that young people tend to go on here and do postgraduate studies. employers very often don't want to hire young people who've got masters and PhDs because they expect more money to start with in the first place, don't they?
Yes, but there's not enough money available. There's not enough money on offer anyway. So what the crisis has done, I mean, one of the most important consequences of the crisis is a huge drop in salaries. And this has actually made degrees and postgraduate degrees and even PhDs somewhat of relative value, at least with respect to the labour market. Now, about the North, this is different. We're talking about two different economies. I mean, the southern economy has been following the euro crisis, and as it has led into a rapid shrinking of its economy through the bailout and the bail-in measures, and this has exacerbated existing problems, structural and otherwise, and has produced results, very violent and sudden results, relatively sudden results in the labour market. In the North, there has been nothing analogous. It's following a different pattern. It's because of the special conditions, its relationship with Turkey, the inflow of investment from Turkey. It's a different economy, so I don't think we can draw too many similarities in that sense.
You keep talking about structural problems and infrastructure. What do you mean? What do you think needs to be done to change this pattern, and not just in the short term, but in the medium and long term? Because it's no good putting a sticking plaster over it for a year or two, is it?
Exactly, and this is what the state is doing. Since 2012, once unemployment has been observed as becoming too high, alarming for Cyprus conditions, the state began these small-scale, targeted, active labour market policies trying to subsidize with public money employers to get them to hire young people, young graduates, and so on.
But most of that was only for 6 months, so what's the point of that?
Exactly. This is based on an individualist conception of the problem, saying that the problem is because of the persons lacking specific attributes, and therefore with these short-term plans it will equip better the young people in the labour market. However, the problem is structural, and coming to that, the structural meaning is because there's a demand, the demand of the economy, the demands of the economy in terms of labour. There has been a huge contraction of the economy. There are simply no jobs available. That's why the Republic of Cyprus is now number one in emigration. Is number one in emigration in the EU. A lot of young people who study abroad do not return, or some people who are here, they leave as soon as they find a job, or they are actively looking for jobs abroad, and once they get an opportunity, they leave, because they realize it's not just unemployment, it's also the very low wages. Even if people get employment, this time, I mean, entering now in the labour market in Cyprus means really low wages for many people.
And a lot of employers, let's be honest here, I know a lot of them are suffering, but a lot have also taken advantage of this situation, because I know a lot of young people who are forced to work sort of as freelancers, so the employer isn't paying social insurance, which is going to impact these young people a few years down the line when it comes to maybe claiming benefits or getting pensions and so on. So are we actually setting up another problem for 40 years hence?
Exactly. This is my analysis. I mean, I believe that these problems, these policies that are being enforced, and this context in which the labour market is unfolding is not only creating longer-term problems. The phenomenon of pseudo-self-employment, for example, that you mentioned, is very important. It's on the rise. We have more people now being registered as self-employed, where in fact it is bogus self-employment. I mean, they're really employees, and just the employer refuses to contribute their social insurance money. We have increasing part-time work. We have increasing casual work that is
But part-time work in itself is not bad. We don't have much job sharing here. Now that could work too, couldn't it? To at least get more people getting some income, presumably low enough that they wouldn't be paying tax either.
If it's voluntary, it's not a problem. It's actually a good thing. But the problem is that this is involuntary. It is usually making people work 2 part-time jobs to make up, or 3 part-time jobs to make up the salary of a full-time job. I mean, if it's a decision of a person to work part-time and make do with less, that's ideal. But usually this is not the case. We have high levels of involuntary part-time work. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with hours, actual hours worked, by the way. It has to do with the status, the hourly paid regime. A person might work many hours, but being registered as part-time and therefore losing other sort of...
So what do you think the government should do to address this problem? We know that Europe is pouring money into youth unemployment schemes. They don't seem to be having any effect elsewhere in Europe, and they're certainly not having an effect in Cyprus.
Yeah, I think that what is needed is a policy change, a policy framework change. It's not just about this scheme or the other scheme. Unless there is public investment and a regulation of the labour market, and unless there is strengthening and extension of collective bargaining to create a sort of environment in the labour market where overexploitation is controlled and so on, I don't think the money that is being poured just doesn't go anywhere. Maybe some people get some experience and some pocket money for 6 months. The employers also get some cheap labour or free labour, but at the end of the day, the problem remains.
All right, but what you've just said will raise a lot of hackles, because we got into this mess in the first place to a pretty large degree because of the bargaining power of the unions in the public sector. And they have, in a sense, helped bring the country to its knees, because they are not productive and they're getting fat pensions, fat payoffs, and very nice salaries. You've just been talking more about the private sector, I think, and it's very difficult to see how you can give the private sector people the sort of protection they need while the government is trying so hard to reform the civil service.
Okay, I disagree with this framing. I don't think the crisis was a result of the public sector. Maybe that caused some imbalances in terms of the budget, but the real problem where the economy near collapsed was the banking sector.
Okay, but the fiscal side of things is to a large degree dictated by the amount of money the government pays out every single month in pensions to former civil servants, in wages for unproductive civil servants. And that's exactly what Yiannis Georgiou, now the finance minister, is saying. You know, if we go back to that, we'll go back to another bail-in. So what's the answer?
The state, I mean, for example, there was this policy of extending the age, the retirement age. This was done a couple of years ago.
It's happened all over Europe.
Yes, but this, what has actually meant in practice, it has meant more money being distributed to highly paid senior civil servants and so on, at the expense of younger colleagues or the youth.
But somebody would argue the other case as well, and that is that governments simply don't have enough money in their pockets to pay pensions to people who used to get them for maybe 10 or 15 years and are now going to be getting them, if we keep the retirement age the same, for 40 years.
Okay, but we're opening up new topics in terms of, I mean, the government has the money that it is willing to have through taxation policy and so on. I mean, it's a matter of priorities and actually finding the group of people that and the section of the population that is expected to contribute to what degree to the public finance. For example, we have the lowest tax in Europe. So if there was a problem of improving the state finances, a progressive taxation could actually be also more just. And Cyprus is now number one in inequality in Europe. Inequality has been growing all over Europe. I mean, the crisis has made the rich richer and the poor poorer. So all these policies of austerity and so on, we should always keep in mind that some people actually benefit from this. Whether this is businesses that can get cheap labor, or they can actually wipe out smaller businesses that cannot stand in a competition and so on. So there are winners and losers out of this crisis. So
there is no clear answer, is the answer, isn't it? There really isn't a clear answer, because if you want to pay pensions, create jobs, or raise taxes, what happens to growth? Without growth, you can't create jobs. Is there an answer? I'm just thinking maybe after all we're always knocking governments for what they're doing, but it doesn't seem that there is any clear-cut solution to what is a problem that affects not just the labour market and youth unemployment, but the whole structure of governments.
I think the problem is much bigger than the governments themselves. I mean, this is a problem, it has to do with how the whole system runs. And the economies are handled. It's not just a matter of one government or the European Union itself. It has to do with the whole capitalist system at the end of the day. But it depends on what level of analysis we're talking. If we go back to the original suggestion about youth unemployment, there is no way any government or the EU can deal with youth unemployment unless the economy expands. And for the economy to expand, it needs investment. That investment can be either private or it can be public. But in order for that to take place, an investment to not lead to just rich people getting richer, there has to be an intervention by the government in the economy, in the labour market, to regulate, control, safeguard minimum standards and so on, in order to allow that investment to actually lead to more jobs, and not just more jobs, but actually quality jobs with proper salaries and limited exploitation.
So just Google youth unemployment in Cyprus and join them next Friday at the University of Nicosia.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Next Friday at the Palace Theatre in Nicosia, there's a piano recital being given by Yiannis Georgiou. He joins us now on the programme. Yanni, before we talk about the actual concert, tell us how you got into being a concert pianist, basically.
Well, I got to love music by listening to my father's record collection. And that's how I fell in love with classical music.
So he wasn't a musician himself?
No, it wasn't. Not a musical family, but I got started on piano lessons and fell in love with the sound of the piano as well. And then, really that was it.
How old were you when you started?
At 6 years old, I started my first piano lesson.
Have you ever thought about other instruments, or it's always for you been the piano?
It's always been the piano.
So when you started, you had your lessons. I suppose you took piano exams?
Yes, I did. But I think the combination of what I was listening to at home and just me progressing through the syllabus of the exams, it was just a love that was growing.
And you went on to study in the UK and then in Russia? Yes,
that's correct. My first studies I did in London, and then I spent 5 years in Moscow at the Tchaikovsky Conservatoire as well, which was a life-forming experience.
In what way?
It was a very sacred place to be for a pianist. There's the halls and the walls speak with so much tradition and art. I was very lucky to be there.
And who was teaching you while you were there? What did they give to you that you think may have, in a sense, influenced your interpretation of all these pieces?
Well, what is fantastic about the teaching in Moscow is that it has a line that goes back to old masters, and the so-called Russian school of playing, which introduces you to beauty of tone and the interpretation, and there's lots of things. I mean, it's just a very, very big picture.
What about language? Did you have to speak Russian to study that?
I learnt it, yes.
So that must have also brought you, in a sense, your appreciation of Russian, I presume, history as well as culture, has also maybe influenced some of the ways that you interpret the music?
Well, yes, it definitely has, and also I should add that another thing that drew me there was the love for the Russian repertoire. I really do love the Russian composers, so it was the natural place to study them.
Let's talk about now the programme that you're going to be performing next week in Nicosia. Tell us about how you put it together, because when you do decide what pieces to play, I presume you've got to think of how they complement each other.
Yes, it's a very nice part of the creative process to draft the programme. You just always think, what goes with what, and what would be nice to follow what, and so in this case, what I've done is that I've used a work by Nicolas Economou, which is a very well-known Cypriot pianist and composer who sadly died quite young. Anyway, his work called Childhood Whims is inspired by Schumann's scenes from childhood, and also inspired by Russian music. So I'm using his work as a link between these pieces, Schumann, Scenes of Childhood, and also Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. And I feel it's just basically three cycles that I'm playing in this program, the Schumann, the Economou, and the Mussorgsky.
So this is happening, we said, next Friday, the 21st of October. It's at 8:30. Now, where can people get tickets? Can they buy them on the door, or should they get there a little bit early or buy them online, perhaps?
The concert's at the Palace Theatre, and you can certainly buy them on the day of the concert from the theatre, but also online. They're available on soldOutTicket.com.cy, I think. Yeah, you can buy them online or at the theatre.
And there's a mobile phone number in this piece of information here. Can we give that out so anybody who's got any further questions can get in touch?
Sure. It's 99693 if somebody wants to ask something about the repertoire or more details about when it's on.
So that is a special recital with Yiannis Georgiou at the Palace Theatre in Nicosia, 8:30. October the 21st. Tickets cost €10 or €7 if you're a pensioner, a full-time student, or serving in the National Guard.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
For the last couple of days in Nicosia, a seminar has been running that is aiming to impart knowledge about CSR and sustainability reporting. How do you do it responsibly, and what are the benefits for you and your company? Joining us from the organisers, FBRH, is Simon Pitsilidis. So what did the seminar cover, Simon?
The seminar covers the Global Reporting Initiative framework. Global Reporting Initiative is one of the most important organizations in the world when it comes to sustainability reporting. Out of the largest 250 global companies, 80% conduct the reporting in accordance to the GRI framework.
Well, what's that framework? Why is this type of reporting more important than any other type of reporting?
Very simply, it's a framework that gets companies to identify, measure, manage, change their most important impacts towards the environment and their stakeholders. And most importantly, stakeholders that can stop them from reaching their objectives.
When you say stakeholders, are you talking about suppliers, customers, or what?
It's suppliers, customers, it's human resources, local society, NGOs, anybody that's surrounding a company. The minute a company is created, as with any human being, when somebody is born or a company is born, there are impacts towards the environment and towards society and stakeholders. Those impacts, if they are not identified, you will not be able to go to the next step of measuring or managing or changing. So the first step is to identify what your impacts are.
Okay, and once you've done that, take us through the next few steps and how you teach this to people at your seminars.
When you identify your impacts, then the next step is to communicate with all your stakeholders, and stakeholders that can stop you from reaching your objectives. That's very important.
Can you give an example of a stakeholder that might stop you reaching your objectives?
Yes, it's like many people remember a few years ago there was a factory, Rainbow, outside of Nicosia, which they produced colours for...
they dyed material,
dyed
didn't they?
material. For argument's sake, this company could have had orders for the next 20 years, the liquidity and means to produce those orders. But one thing which they didn't take into account is when the local community started complaining and saying that they had high instances of cancer.
And it was found, wasn't it, that their effluent was polluting the groundwater in the area?
They ignored, first of all, the local community, whereas they could have not ignored the local community, and they could have brought in different technology to limit their impact on the groundwater or whatever impact they might have, and that would have solved the problem. But they didn't do so. They said, no, it's not us, it's anything else but not us. And most people would remember at some point the local community nearly burnt the place down, and there was a police there in force, and the factory was forced to close down. So when it comes to being sustainable, it's not just a matter of having liquidity and having enough cash and being able to operate. It's being able to identify impacts such as this on stakeholders like the local community, which can stop you from either operating altogether or reaching your objectives.
So you've done that bit, and then what's next in this 4 or 5 step scenario?
Well, the next step is, once you've identified, measured, managed and changed, is you produce a report and you show people that this is who we are, this is our report, and this is what we're doing. What a report is basically helping companies, and all major companies around the world are producing reports, is they are able to prove in our world, which is basically transparent, everybody knows about anything that's happening, that they are a responsible company. And they're able to answer critical questions, like they know what their impacts are, and also they are showing how they are measuring and managing and changing their impacts through the report. So if anybody comes up and says, well, this company is not that responsible, they can point to their report and say that we are responsible, we're not perfect, but
this is what we're doing to try and become more perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Each year we're revisiting our targets, we're talking to our stakeholders, and we're limiting the negative impacts we have towards the environment and our stakeholders, and increasing our positive impact.
Now, how does this go down in Cyprus? We are, let's be very honest, not very good here at CSR in any form. So at seminars like you've been holding this week, what feedback do you get?
People are genuinely very interested, and when they understand how responsible CSR is conducted, they also see the benefits that comes for a company when they do CSR reporting in a responsible way.
How long have you been doing this in Cyprus, and how many companies have now sort of signed up to your way of reporting?
There's 2 companies in Cyprus which produce reports in accordance to GRI. We've been certified in Cyprus for almost a year by the Global Reporting Initiative, and we're the only certified training partners. And soon enough, we're going to have the courses also funded by the local Human Resources Authority.
But 2 companies out of however many million we've got in Cyprus, I mean, how are you going to up that figure and get this message across to make our companies more sustainable?
We have launched an educational website, not just for Cyprus, but for the UK and Greece, which is at www.sustainCase.com. Through this website, and through weekly newsletters, we're showing how major companies around the world are dealing with their most important impacts and which actions they're taking and how they are changing towards the better.
And I think it's been proven that companies with a good CSR profile actually increase their profits.
They do, and there's numerous studies to show this. There's a study I have in mind from Harvard, which is on the Sustained Case website, which gives details of how they have identified that companies which are, let's say, good companies, responsible companies, that they are more profitable than companies which are not. There's also studies which this should, ring alarm bells for any company around the world. The one that comes in mind is a study by Nielsen in 60 countries with 30,000 people, which shows that the millennial generation and Generation X, that is from 1990s to 2000 and from 2000 to date, they're willing to pay more for products and services from companies that are responsible than to go for products or services from companies who are irresponsible. So basically the message is from people who are having the buying power now and who will have the buying power, that they will not accept companies which are not responsible.
Simon Pitsilidis, and the next seminar will be sometime later in October. You can find out more at fbrh.eu/CSR. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.